The some of the dispute is, what do you view the canon as? Is it a list of authoritative books, or is it an authoritative list of books? So is the authority in the list of the canon, or are you just saying here's a list put together by us, but it's a list of books that are authoritative? And it seems like now we're thinking mainly in terms of this is an authoritative list of books, whereas for a lot of the history they're like, okay, well here's our list of books that are obviously authoritative, but there are some disagreements along the way. Hey, so Wes, you going to break down canonization for us?
Yeah, so basically, what I was talking about when I was on Andrew Schultz is that there are. Uh, so what you guys read, I think, in that super chat was correct. In that the only official binding statement by an ecumenical church council was at Trent. So 1446 is when they delineate on the canon of Scripture, and that's the first time that they attach an anathema to it. So before that,
Wow.
there is no kind of statement saying that this is what you have to believe. So ironically, what Trent ends up doing is it actually anathematizes a bunch of individuals who were part of the trial of Luther. So guys like Desiderius Erasmus, Cardinal Jimenez, Cardinal Cayetan, who were part of the original group who were putting Luther on trial, they themselves did not adhere to, there were disagreements on the different scriptures. So the 66 were like the core that everybody agreed on, and then throughout the various traditions in East and West, there were disagreements. And you even have popes like Pope Gregory the Great, who wrote a commentary on Job, who says that Maccabees is good for reading, but it is not inspired scripture. And so there's a difference between this idea of a canon that is for edification and a canon that is inspired scripture. And that's always the disagreement. Where are the dividing lines between those two groups? There's an excellent book written by a friend of mine, Dr. John Mead, called Early Christian Canon Lists, and they go through a lot of this information. So if anybody's interested, it's not necessarily an easy read, but Early Christian Canon Lists by Dr. John Mead and Ed Gallagher is the kind of book that goes through all that information and goes through the canons one by one, including some early Jewish canons, and talks about, okay, why do all of these differ? And then what is the evidence for sort of the earliest and most reliable ones. So I personally would say that the Protestant reformers got it right, but I also grant that there is historical precedence, even though I disagree with it, for other lists within both the Roman Catholic canon, the Eastern Orthodox canon, and then the Ethiopian canon even has, like, I think it's 84. So they have a whole bunch more.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you're basically saying you could make a case. You fall down on the side of this particular case, but you understand different cases can be made for different collections.
Yeah, and so that's why the whole conversation of like, well, Luther took these books out, or the Catholics put these books in, I think is really, it's not fully understanding the situation that was going on even during the Protestant Reformation, because some of the first debates of the Protestant Reformation between guys like Luther and Erasmus, Erasmus agreed with Luther on the canon. He just disagreed on, the freedom of the will versus the bondage of the will. So that really wasn't necessarily even the conversation. And you go back to people like Jerome, who advocates for the 66, or even Melito of Sardis, who advocates for the 66 even earlier than that in the 2nd century. But you have all of these canon lists that are put throughout. So usually the list that's kind of put, there's some sort of fuzziness with the Council of Rome, because it's a local synod. It's not an ecumenical council. And so they put out a list, but then there's even some historical messiness with the Decree of Damasus, which is the list that comes out of that. Is it actually from that council, or is it a later accretion that's then read back onto it? So ideally, you try to stick with the most historically reliable primary sources.
So my question was so there were councils where lists of the books were given, and the deuterocanonical or apocryphal books were included in the lists. I understand now that when we say that at the Council of Trent, this is dogmatically affirmed. Prior to this, we don't have quite the same level of ecumenical or dogmatic affirmation and all that. But what would exactly be technically, practically, the difference or the lack of significance, if you will, of, for example, a list of books issued during these councils in the first centuries, in the 4th century, would that not be considered binding? Would somebody who comes along later and presents a completely different canon be considered in their right to do so up until Council of Trent?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think ultimately what they're doing is they're providing lists of the resources that they themselves are deriving kind of their faith and practice from. But there's a differentiation in the levels of that some of the books are useful and are for edification practices and are recognized throughout the church for the purpose of like the encouragement of the saints. And then there are a list of books that are inspired scripture. So I think if you were to go back in time and talk to individuals at said councils when they provide said lists and say, well, then you're saying officially these are the books of inspired scripture, no more, no less, I think they would be very uncomfortable with those sorts of statements. I don't think that's what they're saying. Or even like Athanasius's Easter letter, his festal letter, is sometimes used as, because he provides a very authoritative canon list. And I think if you were to go back and ask Athanasius, is what you're doing like you putting the final stamp on those books? I think he would be like, no, that's not what I'm doing. But these are the books that I am using as kind of, this is the Christian authoritative literature that we reference from. And this is especially true when you look at some of the earliest manuscripts. You may have heard of the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinaiticus, where
My favorite.
Famously.
that the very famous. In fact, I have a facsimile back on my. So, like the Codex Sinaiticus includes a number of books that nobody thinks are canon today. The Shepherd of Hermes and the Epistle of Barnabas, and that's not because they thought it was scripture. It's because people would have thought of these kind of official codices, these books, as including scripture, but like we think of a Bible in like the single volume today as the Bible, but in the past, they would have thought of the scriptural books as independent written documents, and they would have thought of like Codex Sinaiticus as including scripture rather than that whole kind of volume being scripture itself.
Yeah, I've heard. I don't remember who said this, but I heard years ago. Basically, the some of the dispute is, what do you view the canon as? Is it a list of authoritative books, or is it an authoritative list of books? So is the authority in the list of the canon, or are you just saying here's a list put together by us, but it's a list of books that are authoritative? And it seems like now we're thinking mainly in terms of this is an authoritative list of books, whereas for a lot of the history they're like, okay, well here's our list of books that are obviously authoritative, but there are some disagreements along the way.
Yeah, that's F.F. Bruce. So
Okay.
he said it's not a authoritative list of books, it's a list of authoritative books. And I think that's correct. And you can look at individuals like Chuck Hill, who wrote a book on the canon of scripture, where he says, the early church, when they were having these conversations, were recognizing that which was inspired. They weren't putting the official designation on. And this is actually where I think the Orthodox and the Protestants would have more in union, in that we don't necessarily say that the magisterium is that which puts the official stamp on it, right? So there's more of like, as you said, I think earlier, AP, that there's this recognition of that which the church has always kind of considered as useful and authoritative, whereas the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church puts more of an official stamp on it, particularly at Trent, especially when they add the anathemas. And there are people who are at Trent who are actually uncomfortable with the anathema being listed with it, because then that damns people. I mean, it arguably damns Jerome, right? So that's complicated in that sense, if you're retroactively reading that back onto individuals like that. But also, so Chuck Hill uses this illustration where he says, if you were to go back in time and you ask the early church, why did you choose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? They would look at you strangely and they would say, I don't know what you mean choose. These are the books that were handed down to us from the apostles. It's like asking the question, why did you choose your parents? You didn't choose your parents.
Yeah. So funnily enough, I only, you probably saw, I basically learned this as we were speaking here.
It's
but
basically.
But so the idea generally in Christianity, traditionally and historically, is that this is the Bible. This is the way we have received it from the Church, and this is how we continue it. It is then only the Catholic Church that in the that at the Council of Trent very, very firmly says this is what it is, and we don't accept anything else. Pretty much.
Yeah, admittedly, I don't know too much about what kind of the Eastern Orthodox or the Oriental Orthodox. Isn't that funny? Oriental means East, and yet they're different groups.
I think about the same thing very often.
Yeah, pick a word, guys. Pick a word.
Yeah. But admittedly, there's a blind spot there for me in the sense of I know far more about the councils of the Roman Catholic Church in terms of the official designations on that than I do about the Eastern traditions. But
you see, he doesn't know.
Yeah. So just to clarify, two things. One, Wes pointed out he drew attention to what we have here, namely the Protestant Eastern Orthodox Brotherhood Club. So you're saying, hey, we're all on the same page in viewing the canon as a list of authoritative books. So as far as what you were saying, and then you said things are a little different at Trent. So beforehand, it just would have been very common to view these as the canon lists as lists of authoritative documents, and then at Trent, it's now we're making this an authoritative list of Christian texts. So we're changing. We're switching from list of authoritative books to authoritative list of books. We're settling this.
Yeah, and I think arguably before Trent, there would have been no one official Roman Catholic Bible in that sense that they would have all agreed upon. And then you have, like I said, popes who would have disagreed with various kind of breakdowns of that. But part of this is because the Christian faith is far more of a conversation in that regard than something like Islam, right? Like Islam has this formal authority that's top down, and there's, with the Uthmanic recension, far more of a control factor that plays into that.
One question that I have, just to clarify all of this, I think it's pretty much clear, but so when certain people come and now say that Martin Luther removed books from the Bible, to my understanding, what I understand now from this whole conversation is that if it wasn't for the Council of Trent, this accusation that Martin Luther actually removed books from the Bible wouldn't make much sense, or wouldn't be a very solid accusation.
Well, if the accusation applies to Luther, then it would have to apply to a number of other very key figures in the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And so they agreed with Luther at least on that point. And then it's in the Counter-Reformation when they really come down strong on the Protestants, because there's a conversation going on, but really, so the Counter-Reformation starts in 1545, and the first meeting is in 1546, but by 1555, it's basically a done deal. The Catholics and the Roman Catholics and the Protestants are not agreeing on those things. And so after that, they're more talking about what is Catholic practice going forward, rather than, how do we flesh out the details and try to make more of a unification between the Protestant movement, which is growing, and the Roman Catholic Church, which is seen as the established faith at that point in the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire.
Now I get it.
Now even AP understands something.